The Japanese thought their ships were safe. They laughed at our bombs. They had no idea we were about to turn our bombers into flying chainsaws. The war was not going well. By late 1942, American bombers in the Southwest Pacific had fired thousands of rounds, dropped hundreds of tons of ordnance, and watched nearly every Japanese convoy sail through unmolested. The numbers told the story. In January 1943, Allied aircraft attacked a Japanese convoy headed to Leh. Result: 2 ships sunk, 3 damaged. The rest delivered their cargo and troops without significant loss. The problem was fundamental. Bombers flying at safe altitudes gave enemy ships too much time to maneuver. Torpedo attacks required extensive training and still produced mediocre results. Medium-level horizontal bombing proved nearly worthless against moving vessels. Japanese commanders had noticed. Their convoys crossed the Bismarck Sea with growing confidence, reinforcing troops throughout New Guinea, despite American air superiority in the theater. The strategic implications were clear. If American bombers couldn't stop ships at sea, Australia itself might be at risk. Then, a 3-year-old former Navy chief with a personal vendetta started bolting guns onto aircraft in ways the factory never intended. His name was Marcus Grizzly Thorne. Everyone called him Grizzly. What he built would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. Grizzly Thorne had retired from the U.S. Navy in December 1939 after 21 years as an enlisted naval aviator. He'd served as a flight instructor at Pensacola, flown fighters with the top Hatters Squadron, and accumulated more mechanical knowledge than most engineers with advanced degrees. He'd learned to fly on his own time as an aviation machinist's mate, eventually earning his wings through sheer determination despite lacking the formal education for officer training. He moved to the Philippines with his wife and 4 children, helping establish an airline called Philippine Airlines. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, the military immediately commandeered his aircraft and personnel. Thorne was sworn into the Army Air Force as a captain. The Japanese swept through the Philippines faster than anyone anticipated. Thorne flew medical supplies into besieged Bataan in an unarmored aircraft through hostile airspace. For this action, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Then came the news every family man dreads. His wife and children were trapped in Manila as the city fell. They would spend the next 3 years in Japanese captivity at the University of Tomas internment camp. Thorne evacuated to Australia. He had nothing left to lose and every reason to make the Japanese pay. When Lieutenant General George C. Kenny arrived in Australia in summer 1942 to command the 5th Air Force, he inherited a disaster. His bomber force was ineffective against ships. His fighters were outnumbered. His maintenance system was overwhelmed, and morale was somewhere below the waterline. Walking through an Australian airfield, Kenny spotted something that shouldn't have existed. Several A-20 Havoc light bombers sat with their glass noses removed, replaced with solid metal housing, 4 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns. These were early field modifications. The modifications were crude but clearly functional. He asked who was responsible. They pointed to Grizzly Thorne. Kenny found Thorne working on the modifications, having scavenged weapons from wrecked fighters that would never fly again. The old Navy man explained his thinking with straightforward logic. High-altitude bombing wasn't working. To hit ships, you had to fly low. But flying low exposed bombers to devastating anti-aircraft fire from ship decks. The solution: turn the bomber into a weapon that could suppress that defensive fire before releasing its bombs. 50-caliber machine guns firing forward could shred deck crews and silence anti-aircraft positions. With defenses suppressed, the bomber could approach close enough to release bombs with devastating accuracy. The bombs would skip across the water like stones and slam into ship hulls at point-blank range. Kenny immediately grasped the implications. He made Thorne a member of his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him one directive: convert as many aircraft as possible. The A-20 Havoc modifications proved the concept, but the aircraft had limitations: limited range, small bomb load, and there was a critical shortage of A-20 seconds in the theater. because most were being sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Thorne set his sights on a larger target, the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25 had everything the A-20 lacked. Range, 1,350 miles, enough to reach any Japanese base in the theater. Bomb load, 3,600 pounds, and durability, twin engines that could absorb significant battle damage. But it was also nearly twice the size of an A-20. Many veteran pilots were skeptical that a medium bomber could be used for low-level strafing attacks. The aircraft seemed too large, too sluggish, too vulnerable. Thorne didn't care what people thought should work. He cared what actually worked. Working with Jack Fox, the senior North American aviation technical representative in Australia, Thorne began systematically gutting B-25 seconds. The bombardier position was removed entirely. Since pilots would release bombs manually during low-level attacks, there was no need for a bombardier or bomb sight. The transparent nose was replaced with solid metal housing, 4 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns. Then Thorne added something the factory never contemplated: gun packages, mounted on each side of the fuselage below the cockpit. 2 guns on each side. Total forward-firing armament, 8. 50-caliber machine guns. The first test installation created immediate problems. Blast from the side-mounted guns peeled skin off the fuselage. The area around the gun mounts vibrated so violently it threatened structural failure. Ammunition feed systems jammed. Thorne fixed each problem methodically. Blast tubes extended beyond the propellers to channel muzzle flash safely away from the aircraft. Metal plates reinforced the fuselage around gun positions. Ammunition racks were repositioned inside the aircraft for reliable feeding. He even attempted more exotic configurations. One experiment involved mounting 30 water-cooled, 30-caliber guns in the bomb bay, pointed downward to strafe troops in trenches. The vibration loosened skin around the bomb bay, and the concept was abandoned. But Thorne never stopped testing the boundaries of what was possible. The man was not subtle about getting what he needed. Stories circulated among the squadrons. One unverified but widely told tale claimed he drew a gun on a supply officer who refused to provide necessary parts. Another story suggested that when a broken finger healed crooked and interfered with holding throttles and wrenches, he cut it off himself rather than let it slow his work. The finger was definitely missing. The exact circumstances remained the subject of speculation. But the stories, whether true or embellished, captured something essential about the man. Nothing would stand between him and building weapons that could kill Japanese ships. By late February 1943, Thorne had converted 12 B-25 seconds into what Kenny called commerce destroyers. They were assigned to the 90th Bomb Squadron under Major Edward L. Lang. Pilots began intensive training on the new aircraft and tactics. While Thorne solved the gun problem, another officer was solving the bombing problem. Major William Benn commanded the 63rd Bombardment Squadron flying B-17 Flying Fortresses. He was equally frustrated with high-altitude bombing results against ships. The massive 4-engine bombers could carry enormous bomb loads, but ships simply maneuvered out of the way before bombs arrived. Ben began experimenting with a radical approach, flying the B-17 on the deck at 200 to 250 feet above the ocean. At high speed, parallel to the ship, the bomber would release bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs would hit the water and skip like flat stones across the surface. They would either skip directly into the ship's hull and explode on impact, or sink alongside the vessel and detonate underwater, mining the hull and rupturing it catastrophically. Alternatively, pilots could hold bombs until directly overhead the target at mast height, then drop them to penetrate deep into the ship before exploding. Ben demonstrated the technique's effectiveness in October 1942, leading a half-dozen B-17 seconds in a low-altitude attack on Rabaul that sent 6 Japanese ships to the bottom. The term skip bombing quickly spread throughout the 5th Air Force. General Kenny recognized that he now had 2 complementary innovations. Thorne's strafer modifications would suppress defensive fire. Ben's skip bombing would ensure hits at close range. combined with high-altitude attacks to scatter formations and Australian Beaufighters to provide additional strafing support. The Allies now had a coordinated attack system. The Japanese were about to provide an opportunity to test it. Intelligence intercepts in mid-February 1943 revealed Japanese plans to send a major convoy from Rabaul to Lae, New Guinea. The convoy would carry approximately 6,900 troops from the 51st Division, along with ammunition, fuel, and supplies. It represented Japan's last major attempt to reinforce their New Guinea garrison by sea. On February 28, 1943, the convoy departed Rabaul. 8 transport ships carrying troops and supplies, escorted by 8 destroyers. Approximately 100 Japanese fighter aircraft would provide air cover during the voyage. Japanese commanders considered the operation risky. Their own war games predicted losses of 4 out of 10 transports and 30 to 40 aircraft. They gave the mission a 50/50 chance of success, but New Guinea troops needed reinforcement. The alternative was marching troops more than 140 miles over inhospitable swamp, mountain, and jungle terrain without roads. The convoy was the lesser of 2 bad options. Allied reconnaissance spotted the convoy on March 1st. General Kenny ordered the attack. The first attacks came on March 2nd as B-17 seconds struck from 5,000 feet. The results were typical of high-altitude bombing. 1 transport sunk, 2 damaged, 1 destroyer set on fire. Most bombs splashed harmlessly into the sea as ships maneuvered. Japanese commanders relaxed slightly. They had weathered the American air attack with acceptable losses. The convoy would reach Lae on schedule. They had no idea what was coming on March the 3rd. That evening, pilots in the 90th Bomb Squadron gathered for final briefings. Major Lang's men would lead the low-level attack in Thorne's modified B-25 seconds. They had practiced skip bombing against the wreck of the SS Pruth, a rusted liner that had run aground near Port Moresby in 1923. They used markings scratched on windshields instead of bomb sites. They learned to fly so low that ocean spray hit their aircraft. 1 crew had been lost during training when they struck the wreck's mast. The squadron buried their comrades and returned to training the next morning. Everyone understood the stakes. If the convoy reached Lae, the Japanese would use those troops to mount offensives throughout New Guinea. Australia's security depended on stopping those ships at sea. At 8:55 a.m., Major Lang received the order, Cape Ward Hunt, 930. Let's go. The attack plan was precise and complex. B-17 seconds would bomb from 7,000 feet first, disrupting the convoy's formation and forcing ships to maneuver. This would reduce concentrated anti-aircraft fire and make individual ships vulnerable. At 10 a.m., the first B-17 seconds and medium-altitude B-25 seconds. Bombs rained down from multiple altitudes simultaneously. Japanese ships maneuvered violently. Crew members later reported seeing 2 burning transport ships accidentally ram each other while attempting to evade bombs. Then 13 Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF Beaufighters, swept in at deck level. The Japanese destroyers, seeing aircraft approaching low and fast, assumed they were torpedo bombers. They turned bow on to present smaller targets against torpedo attack. It was exactly the wrong response. The Beaufighters carried no torpedoes. They were heavy fighters armed with 4 20mm cannons in the nose and 6 30-caliber machine guns in the wings. Designed to destroy bombers, they now had perfect bow to stern strafing runs on Japanese destroyers. The results were catastrophic. 20mm cannon fire chewed through destroyer decks. Japanese sailors manning exposed anti-aircraft positions were cut down where they stood. Japanese destroyers had no armor plating. Cannon rounds and machine gun fire penetrated multiple decks, killing crew members throughout the ships. With destroyer defenses suppressed and the convoy scattered, Grizzly Thorne's commerce destroyers entered the battle. Major Lang's 12 modified B-25 seconds came in at 25 to 100 feet above the water. They flew faster than 250 miles per hour, low enough that pilots could see individual Japanese soldiers on transport decks. 8 50-caliber machine guns per aircraft opened fire simultaneously. Eyewitness accounts describe what happened next in stark terms. One pilot later wrote, "Then I realized what I was watching were human beings. I was watching hundreds of those Japanese just blown off the deck by those machine guns. They just splintered around the air like sticks in a whirlwind and they'd fall in the water." The combined firepower of 12B, 25 seconds, swept transport decks clean. Anti-aircraft crews died at their positions. Soldiers waiting to disembark were cut down by the hundreds. The strafing runs lasted seconds, but they were comprehensive and devastating. Then came the bombs. Flying at masthead height, pilots released 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs skipped twice across the water surface before slamming into ship hulls. The delay fuses meant bombs exploded after penetrating the hull, rupturing vessels from inside. Behind them came 12 A-20 Havocs, also skip bombing and strafing. They dropped 20 bombs, 10 direct hits and 2 near misses. 20 minutes after the attack began, it was over. Every transport ship was sunk, sinking, or so badly damaged it would never reach land. 3 destroyers were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. 3 more were burning or disabled. At 3:10 p.m. on March the 3rd, reconnaissance aircraft returned to the battle site. They found 4 transports burning and stationary, 1 destroyer burning and immobile, another destroyer abandoned and drifting, and a 3rd picking up survivors. The attacks continued. By the morning of March 4th, all 8 transport ships had been sunk. 4 destroyers were at the bottom. 4 destroyers escaped, heavily damaged and packed with approximately 2,700 survivors. Of 6,900 Japanese troops and sailors in the convoy, approximately 3,000 were dead. Another 1,000 floated in the water clinging to wreckage. Allied losses: 1 B-17, 3 P-38 seconds, and 13 airmen killed. 1 additional gunner died when Major Lang's damaged B-25 collapsed on landing. The battle represented one of the most lopsided victories in the history of aerial warfare. General Douglas MacArthur called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. Japanese destroyer Captain Tamaichi Hara was more direct. Japan's defeat there was unbelievable. Never was there such a debacle. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul, wrote, "It is certain that the success obtained by the American Air Force in this battle dealt a fatal blow to the South Pacific. The strategic impact was immediate and permanent. Japan never again attempted to send a large convoy through waters controlled by American aircraft. All future resupply efforts used small barges hugging the coastline under cover of darkness. The inability to reinforce and resupply troops in New Guinea by sea directly contributed to Japan's eventual loss of the entire territory." On March the 20th, 1943, a secret Allied report summarized follow-up operations. The slaughter continued till nightfall. The report noted, "If any survivors were permitted to slip by our strafing aircraft, they were a minimum of 30 miles from land in water thickly infested by man-eating sharks." The report was clinical in its assessment. Air crews systematically hunted Japanese survivors in lifeboats and rafts. Messages like, "Sighted barge consisting of 200 survivors, have finished attack. No survivors," became routine. This aspect of the battle remains controversial. At the time, it generated no public criticism. One officer who flew these missions stated simply, "The enemy is out to kill you, and you are out to kill the enemy. You can't be sporting in war." Grizzly Thorne's modifications became standard across the Pacific theater. North American aviation eventually incorporated variations of his armament innovations into factory production. Later B-25 models included the heavily armed B-25G, B-25H, and some B-25J variants. The B-25J could carry up to 18 50-caliber machine guns total, with 14 of them firing directly forward. One version carried the firepower of 3 P-51 Mustangs in its forward-firing guns alone. Thorne himself was sent back to the United States to oversee factory production of B-25 seconds with enhanced armament. He later returned to the Pacific where he was wounded in a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte in late 1944. He retired from the Army as a full colonel in June 1948. Due to physical disability, he re-established the airline he had helped start before the war in the Philippines. He was reunited with his wife and children after the liberation of the Philippines in 1945. On October 11th, 1957, while flying a charter plane, he was caught in a storm and killed in the ensuing crash. He was 57 years old. He is buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola. Throughout his military service, Thorne received the Distinguished Flying Cross with a second award, the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, and the World War II Victory Medal. Major William Benn, who pioneered skip bombing techniques, died on January 18, 1943, 2 months before the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He did not live to see his tactics destroy the Japanese convoy. Major Edward L. Lang continued leading the 90th Squadron after the battle. On April 30, 1943, he died in a crash at Dobodura Airfield. He was attempting a flashy landing maneuver in a B-25 heavily loaded with fuel, 8 passengers, baggage, tools, and 2,000 pounds of bombs. The aircraft stalled during a sharp pull-up, went into a flat spin, and crashed. There were no survivors. He left behind a wife and 2 daughters. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved multiple concepts simultaneously. Before the battle, high-altitude bombing against ships achieved hit rates below 5%. Allied attacks on Japanese convoys in early 1943 produced minimal results despite hundreds of sorties. At the Bismarck Sea, skip bombing techniques achieved hit rates above 50%. The A-20 Havoc scored 10 direct hits and 2 near misses from 20 bombs dropped. The improvement was revolutionary. A tactic that increased hit rates more than tenfold meant ships were no longer safe at sea under Allied air cover. The battle also validated coordinated attacks from multiple altitudes and directions. High-altitude bombers scattered formations. Fighters provided top cover. Bow fighters suppressed defenses. Strafers neutralized anti-aircraft crews. Skip bombers delivered killing blows. Japanese forces attacking from a single direction at a single altitude could not defend against simultaneous threats from above, at medium level, and at masthead height. The victory at the Bismarck Sea represented more than tactical innovation. It demonstrated that systematic engineering improvements and coordinated tactics could overcome significant enemy advantages. Japanese destroyers in March 1943 were experienced, well-armed, and supported by substantial air cover. They were defeated by aircraft modified in field workshops using salvaged parts, flown by pilots who had practiced their attacks on a rusted wreck. The strategic lessons rippled across the Pacific War. After the Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea could not be reinforced or resupplied by conventional convoy. They relied on barge traffic, hugging coastlines, and submarine runs, neither of which could deliver the volume of men and material required for sustained operations. This directly enabled Allied offensives throughout New Guinea. Japanese garrisons, unable to receive reinforcements, were systematically isolated and overwhelmed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also proved Billy Mitchell's theories about land-based aircraft versus naval vessels. No American or Australian ships participated in the battle, except PT boats in follow-up operations. Yet, the Allied victory was absolute. Perhaps most importantly, the battle validated the approach of aggressive field modification and tactical experimentation. Grizzly Thorne didn't wait for factory engineers to approve his ideas. He built prototypes using salvaged parts and proved concepts in combat before formal authorization existed. General Kenny supported this approach explicitly. He told factory engineers about Thorne's modifications after 12 aircraft were already in combat and 60 more were being converted. The engineers had insisted such modifications were impossible. Kenny's response was simple. They've already destroyed a Japanese convoy. Not every innovation worked. General Kenny admitted that many experiments failed. His chief of staff, Major General Don Wilson, complained there was too much experimentation and not enough standardized production. Kenny once attempted to incite a volcano into activity by bombing it with 2,000-pound bombs. It didn't work. 3 RAF. 20 Bostons were destroyed, probably by experimental fragmentation bombs with new fuses. A B-25 and crew were killed during skip bombing training when they struck the mast of the Pruth wreck. But the alternative was accepting inadequate results. Before Thorne's modifications and skip bombing tactics, American bombers were largely ineffective against Japanese shipping. Allied attacks in early 1943 proved that conventional tactics weren't working. Innovation carried risk, but maintaining the status quo carried certainty. The Japanese would continue reinforcing their positions throughout the Pacific. Grizzly Thorne was not a trained engineer. He was a Navy chief petty officer who learned mechanics by doing. He taught himself to fly by buying a surplus seaplane on enlisted pay. He lacked the formal education that would have qualified him for officer training in his early Navy career. What he possessed was practical knowledge, mechanical aptitude, and complete disregard for conventional limitations. That level of practical problem-solving extended to aircraft modification. When told a modification was impossible or unauthorized, Thorne's response was simple: build it, test it, and prove it works. If it saved pilot lives and killed enemy ships, regulations were secondary considerations. This approach generated conflict with supply officers and administrative staff. It also produced the aircraft that destroyed the Japanese convoy at the Bismarck Sea. One aspect of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains ethically complex. After the main battle ended on March the 3rd, approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors remained in the water. Allied aircraft and PT boats systematically hunted survivors for several days. The official justification was preventing these survivors from reaching shore and reinforcing Japanese positions. General Kenny's staff termed these operations mopping up. Pilots reported eliminating survivors in lifeboats and clinging to wreckage. No one at the time publicly questioned these actions. Modern military historians have debated whether strafing survivors constituted a war crime under international law. The legal consensus remains unclear. Survivors in organized lifeboats heading toward shore could be considered combatants attempting to rejoin their units. Survivors clinging to wreckage in shark-infested waters 30 miles from land might be considered hors de combat, out of combat, and therefore protected. The historical context matters. Japan had established patterns of brutality toward prisoners and civilians throughout the Pacific. The Bataan Death March had occurred 1 year earlier. American forces operating in the Pacific had witnessed Japanese treatment of prisoners firsthand. This does not legally justify the actions. It does explain why no controversy emerged at the time. The public viewed the elimination of survivors as appropriate given enemy conduct. The question remains, at what point does tactical necessity become unnecessary killing? The Battle of the Bismarck Sea offers no easy answers. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted 3 days. The main attack on March the 3rd lasted 20 minutes. 8 transport ships, 4 destroyers, and approximately 3,000 Japanese troops and sailors were lost. But the real victory was not measured in ships sunk or casualties inflicted. The real victory was proving that innovative tactics and field modifications could overcome conventional military advantages. That land-based aircraft could dominate sea lanes without naval support. That aggressive experimentation, even with significant risk, produced better results than cautious adherence to failed doctrine. Grizzly Thorne's modifications transformed the B-25 Mitchell from a mediocre medium bomber into a ship-killing weapon that defined aerial anti-shipping operations for the rest of the Pacific War. Skip bombing techniques pioneered by William Benn and others became standard practice across all theaters. The coordinated attack doctrine developed for the Bismarck Sea became the template for subsequent operations throughout the Pacific, and the strategic lesson was absorbed by both sides. After March 1943, no major Japanese convoy attempted to cross waters under Allied air control in daylight. The ability to move troops and supplies by sea had been effectively neutralized. This was the legacy of one Navy chief with a vendetta and a wrench, working in an Australian hangar with salvaged parts. He didn't have proper authorization. He didn't have factory specifications. He didn't have time. What he had was 12 modified B-25 seconds, and pilots trained on a rusted wreck. It was enough to change the course of the war.